She found him bleeding in her cellar, but touching him awakened something that could damn her daughters forever. The moment Lyraleth's fingers touched the wounded stranger's skin, ancient magic surged through her bloodline, and her three daughters' eyes began to glow. What she had awakened in the darkness would either save their kingdom or destroy everything she loved. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story begins with a woman who had no idea she was about to change the fate of two warring worlds. In the shadow-drenched forests of Thornwick Dominion, where ancient oaks whispered secrets older than memory and moonlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, Lyraleth Thornwick lived a life built on carefully maintained lies. At 32, she was a woman of ethereal beauty, despite the exhaustion that lined her amber eyes that held flecks of gold. She kept hidden beneath glamour, magic she pretended not to possess. Her cottage, nestled in a clearing where wildflowers bloomed in impossible abundance, looked quaint and ordinary to passing travelers. They couldn't see the protective wards woven into every stone, the blessing circles carved into the foundation, or the way shadows bent around her home like living guardians. To the world, she was simply a widow raising three daughters in the aftermath of the vampire wars that had ravaged the kingdom 5 years prior. But Lyraleth carried secrets that ran deeper than the roots of the thornwood trees. The cottage should have been impossible to maintain on a weaver's income, yet somehow there was always food on the table, always warm clothes for the girls, always just enough to survive. The neighbors in the distant village attributed it to her late husband's savings, never questioning why those savings never seemed to run dry. They couldn't see what Lyraleth did in the hours before dawn, when she tended to a garden that yielded impossible harvests. They didn't witness the way she could coax a sick cow back to health with a touch, or how her needlework contained threads that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. The glamour magic she'd inherited from her grandmother's bloodline kept curious eyes from seeing too much. But what they didn't know about her late husband would change everything once the truth came out. Thomas Thornwick hadn't died in a farming accident, as the official record stated. He'd been killed by vampire hunters, not because he was undead, but because he discovered something about Lyraleth's true heritage that certain factions wanted to keep buried. The night he died, he'd been rushing home to warn her that their peaceful life was about to end. He never made it. The memories still haunted Lyraleth's dreams, the way his eyes had gone wide with terror as he burst through the door, blood streaming from wounds that spoke of a cruel, deliberate death. "They know," he'd gasped, falling into her arms as their three young daughters watched in horror from the stairs. "About your grandmother, about what you really are. They're coming." But Thomas had died before he could explain who they were, or what her grandmother's legacy truly meant. Hold that thought, because you haven't yet learned the most dangerous secret of all. Her daughters, Ember at 15, Seraphina at 12, and little Luna at 9, were growing up ignorant of their true heritage. Lyraleth had made sure of that. After what happened to their father, she'd buried every trace of her supernatural abilities beneath layers of careful, mundane routine. Yet she couldn't hide the signs forever. Ember had always been too warm to the touch, and lately, wilted flowers bloomed when she held them. Seraphina could soothe any injury with a gentle caress, though she seemed unaware she was doing anything unusual. And Luna spoke to the woodland creatures as if she understood their replies, which Lyraleth was beginning to suspect. She actually did. The magic was awakening in them naturally, no matter how carefully she tried to suppress it. "Mama," Ember called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular note of concern that made Lyraleth's maternal instincts sharpen. "The milk's gone sour again, and Luna says the chickens won't come out of their coop." Lyraleth set down her embroidery, a piece that would fetch enough coin to keep them fed for a month, though she'd never tell the buyer why the thread seemed to dance with captured starlight. Something was wrong. Animals could sense things that humans couldn't, and soured milk often meant dark magic close by. She stepped outside, bare feet touching the earth, and immediately felt it, a pulse of power so ancient and terrible that it made her knees weak. Something had breached her wards. Something was in her cellar. The cellar that was supposed to be sealed with magic powerful enough to keep out anything short of a demon lord. And that's when she realized whatever was down there wasn't just powerful, it was dying. Girls, she called, keeping her voice carefully steady. Stay inside, and don't come out until I return. No matter what you hear. Ember appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the fading sunlight in a way that reminded Lyraleth painfully of her late husband.
Mama, what's wrong? Your eyes are...
Glowing, Lyraleth's hand flew to her face. She'd lost control of her glamour. The first time in 5 years. It's nothing, sweetheart. Just, Mama needs to check on something. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. The descent into her cellar would change everything, but not in the way she expected. As Lyraleth descended the stone steps, each step revealed more of the impossible. Her protection wards lay in tatters, magic signatures scattered like fallen leaves after a storm. Whatever had broken through them possessed power that rivaled the ancient bloodlines, the kind of power that belonged to the vampire princes of old, the kind of power that should have been extinct. The cellar stretched deeper than it should have, deeper than was architecturally possible. Ancient magic had carved additional chambers from the living rock, creating a sanctuary that existed partially outside normal space. In the furthest chamber, where Lyraleth stored her most dangerous magical components, she found him. He lay crumpled against the far wall like a fallen angel, and despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Lyraleth found herself moving closer. He was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with a kind of lean, powerful build that spoke of centuries of warrior training. His hair was black as a moonless night, falling in waves to his shoulders, and his skin held the pale luminescence that marked him as vampire nobility. But it was the wounds that stopped her breath. Silver burns covered his torso in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had tortured him with blessed silver, the kind that could permanently scar even immortal flesh. Dark blood, too dark to be entirely human, pooled beneath him, and with each shallow breath, more seeped from wounds that should have healed instantly. He'd been poisoned with something specifically designed to kill his kind. But what she sensed about his aura would shatter everything she thought she knew about vampires. There was no malevolence in him, no predatory hunger that marked the undead she'd been taught to fear. Instead, she sensed something that reminded her achingly of Thomas, a deep well of protective love, fierce loyalty, and the kind of honor that would die before compromising those it cared about. Please, he whispered, without opening his eyes, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place, something ancient and refined that spoke of old courts and older power. I know what you are, can smell the magic in your blood. Please. His eyes opened, and Lyraleth's world tilted. They were silver, not the pale gray that some called silver, but true silver, like polished moonlight, given form. And in their depths, she saw something that made her protective instincts override every other consideration. Pain, not just physical agony, but the kind of soul-deep anguish that spoke of losses too great to bear. She'd seen that same look in her own mirror after Thomas's death. But what he said next would trigger something that had been dormant in her bloodline since the night her grandmother died, screaming, "You're dying," she said softly, though they both knew it was stating the obvious. "Better than the alternative," he replied, and there was something in his voice, a weight of years, of terrible choices, made and lived with. "They want me to become something I swore I'd never be. Better to die with honor than live as their weapon." "Who are they?" His laugh was bitter, broken. "The Crimson Court. My family. They've decided I've been rebellious long enough." Lyraleth's blood turned to ice. The Crimson Court. She'd heard whispers, legends that spoke of vampire royalty so powerful they could unmake reality with a thought. If he was fleeing from them. "You're not just any vampire," she breathed. "You're one of them." "Prince Kyle, Shadowbane," he confirmed, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "Third in line to the Obsidian Throne. Former heir, current disappointment, and if they find me, soon-to-be puppet." And that's when the most dangerous realization hit her. She'd met him before, in dreams that had plagued her since childhood. But there was something else, something that made her breath catch, as memories she'd thought were childhood fantasies suddenly snapped into sharp focus. Dreams of silver eyes watching her from shadows. Dreams of a voice calling her name across impossible distances. Dreams of hands that could channel starlight, reaching for her across a void of darkness. "I've seen you before," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Something flickered across his perfect features. Surprise, hope, recognition. "Every night for 23 years, he said softly, amber eyes, flecked with gold, hands that could channel the light of creation itself. I began to think I was going mad. The silver poisoning was spreading. She could see it in the way darkness crept up his veins like poisonous vines. In minutes, maybe less, it would reach his heart. Whatever his politics, whatever his family's crimes, she couldn't watch someone die when she had the power to prevent it, especially not someone who had been calling to her in dreams for over 2 decades. But the moment her skin touched his, the world exploded into light, and 3 little girls upstairs suddenly discovered they were far more powerful than anyone had imagined. Lyraleth placed her hands on his chest, directly over the worst of the silver burns, and called upon magic she hadn't used in 5 years. The moment her skin touched his, the world exploded into light. Power rushed through her like a river breaking free of a dam. Not just her own carefully hoarded magic, but something vast and ancient that had been sleeping in her bloodline. The cellar filled with golden radiance as her true nature, so long suppressed, burst forth like a star being born. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that her magic recognized his, like calling to like across an impossible gulf of time and circumstance. Upstairs, 3 young girls suddenly stopped what they were doing as their eyes blazed with supernatural light. Embers flaring amber like captured flame, Seraphinas shifting to silver like winter moonlight, and Lunas turning deep forest green like the heart of growing things. The awakening had begun, and in a tower, hundreds of miles away, a figure in crimson robes looked up from ancient texts and smiled with teeth like sharpened pearls. "She's found him," the Crimson Duchess purred to her assembled court. "After all these years, the Thornwick Witch has finally taken the bait. Begin the convergence. Tonight, we finish what her grandmother started." But wait until you discover what her grandmother started, and why 3 little girls are about to become the most dangerous weapons in the kingdom. The healing magic flowing through Lyraleth felt different than anything she'd ever channeled. Instead of the gentle, warm energy she was accustomed to, this power burned like liquid starlight, transforming as it moved through her into something that her ancestors' books would have called the deep magic, the kind that rewrote the fundamental laws of reality. Under her touch, Prince Gull's silver poisoning didn't just heal, it reversed, the corrupted darkness fleeing from her light like shadows at dawn. His wounds closed with such perfection that not even scars remained, and the deathly pallor faded from his skin, replaced by the luminous vitality that marked ancient vampire royalty. But the magic didn't stop there. Throughout the cottage above, impossible changes were taking place. Ember felt fire dancing under her skin, flames that brought warmth instead of destruction. And when she touched the wilted roses on the kitchen table, they bloomed into perfect crimson life. Seraphina discovered that every ache and pain she'd carried for years had vanished, her body suddenly humming with perfect health and energy that made her feel like she could run for days without tiring. And Luna, little Luna, found herself understanding the language of growing things, hearing the whispered conversations of the oak trees outside, feeling the heartbeat of the earth beneath the cottage foundations. But what none of them realized was that they were being watched by something that had been hunting their bloodline for 3 generations. In the cellar, Prince Kael's silver eyes opened fully for the first time in days. And what Lyraleth saw there made her breath catch: recognition. Not the recognition of a stranger, grateful for healing, but the recognition of someone who had been searching for her across centuries. "Lyraleth," he whispered, and the way he said her name carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "You're more beautiful than I remembered." Remembered? She tried to pull her hands away, but found she couldn't. The magic still flowed between them, creating a connection that felt older than both their lifetimes. We've never met, haven't we? His hand rose to touch her face, fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with careful reverence. Every night for 23 years, I've dreamed of amber eyes, flecked with gold. Every dawn, I've woken knowing that somewhere in the world, my salvation waited with hands that could channel starlight. And that's when she realized the impossible truth. Their connection had been forged before either of them was born. The magic finally released them, settling into a warm glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats. Kelkiel sat up smoothly, his movements displaying the inhuman grace of vampire nobility, but his eyes never left hers. "The Thornwick line," he said softly. "I should have known. Your grandmother." "My grandmother died when I was 9, Lyraleth interrupted, but something cold crept up her spine. She was just a village-wise woman. Kale's smile was gentle, sad. "Your grandmother, Lyraleth, was the most powerful witch of her generation. She saved my life once, when I was barely more than a fledgling, made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would find her descendant and protect them from the consequences of her mercy." "What consequences?" But before he could answer, they heard the sound that would change everything. Footsteps above too many footsteps, moving with the perfect synchronization of trained killers. Ember's voice drifted down from above, carefully controlled but tinged with fear. "Mama, there are people outside, beautiful people with very pale skin and red eyes. They're asking about you." The Crimson Court had found them. Kyle was on his feet instantly, moving with speed that would have been invisible to human eyes. In the space between one breath and the next, he'd assessed the cellar's defenses, noted every possible escape route, and positioned himself between Lyraleth and the stairs. "How many?" he called up to Ember, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of command. 12, came the steady reply. "Maybe more. They're really beautiful, Mama, like living statues. But Luna's crying and she won't tell me why." Because Luna could feel their hunger. Lyraleth realized the deep magic flowing through the girls had awakened senses they didn't know they possessed. Luna could sense the predatory nature that the Crimson Court vampires carried, like a second skin. And that's when Lyraleth understood the true scope of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't a random encounter. This was the culmination of a plan that had been in motion since before her birth. "They used me," Kayla said quietly, silver eyes reflecting self-directed fury. "My escape, the poison, even finding your cellar, it was all orchestrated to force you to reveal yourself." "Why? What do they want with me?" "The same thing they've wanted from your bloodline for 3 generations," he replied, already moving toward an ancient chest in the corner, a chest Lyraleth had never noticed before. The power to rewrite the fundamental laws of magic itself. "Your grandmother's line doesn't just use magic, Lyraleth, you create it." From the chest, he withdrew weapons that gleamed with their own inner light, silver blades carved with runes that seemed to shift and dance in the magical illumination. Ancient vampire weapons, she realized, the kind that could kill their own kind permanently. But what he said next made her blood freeze in her veins. "Your daughters aren't just manifesting witch magic," he continued, testing the weight of the largest blade. "They're manifesting the 3 aspects of creation magic: fire, healing, and growth. Together, with your power as the focus, they could remake the supernatural world, create new laws of reality itself." "That's impossible, is it?" He gestured toward the stairs, where the sound of approaching footsteps had grown closer. "Look at what you just accomplished. You didn't just heal silver poisoning Lyraleth, you purged it from my bloodline entirely. I'll never be susceptible to silver again." "That's not healing magic. That's reality alteration." The footsteps stopped directly above them. A voice drifted down, melodious, beautiful, and carrying the kind of authority that made reality bend around its words. "Prince Carl, how lovely to find you in such charming company. And Lyraleth Thornwick, your grandmother sends her regards from beyond the veil." But the voice wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from behind them, from the impossible depths of the cellar that shouldn't have existed. They turned to see a figure emerging from shadows that had grown too deep, too dark, too alive. She was beautiful in the way that night sky was beautiful. Vast, terrible, and utterly inhuman. Crimson hair flowed around her like liquid fire, and her eyes held the depth of eternity. Duchess Morvana, Kel breathed, raising his weapons. I should have known you'd cheat. The Crimson Duchess smiled, revealing fangs like polished ivory. Cheat? My dear nephew, I prefer to think of it as being thorough. Did you really think we'd trust something this important, Chance? And that's when Lyraleth realized the most terrifying truth of all. This woman hadn't just killed her grandmother. She'd been hunting her family for generations, waiting for the right combination of bloodline and desperation. The cellar exists in folded space, Morvana continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. A lovely bit of magic your grandmother created, actually, before we convinced her to see reason. Multiple entrances, all leading to the same impossible room. Very convenient for private conversations. More figures emerged from the shadows, vampires of such ancient power that the air itself seemed to thicken around them. The Crimson Court in all their terrible glory come to collect what they considered theirs. You have precisely one choice, Lyraleth, the Duchess said, her voice carrying compulsion magic that made normal humans fall to their knees in worship. Join us willingly, teach your daughters to channel their power as we direct, and live in luxury beyond your wildest dreams. Or, she gestured, and suddenly Lyraleth could hear her daughters screaming upstairs. Or watch them burn as your grandmother did, and know that their deaths brought you nothing but a few extra moments of defiance. But what the Crimson Court hadn't counted on was the bond that now connected Lyraleth and Kael, a bond forged by magic older than their bloodlines, stronger than their fears, and powered by a love that had been growing across 23 years of shared. There is a third option, Keller said quietly, and his voice carried power that made the ancient vampires step back. One you've overlooked in all your centuries of plotting. And when he revealed what that third option was, it would either save both their worlds or destroy them entirely. The third option hung in the air, like a blade poised to fall, and Duchess Morvana's perfect features shifted into something far more dangerous than mere beauty. Around her, the assembled vampires of the Crimson Court moved with predatory grace, forming a circle that made escape impossible, or so they believed. But they'd made one critical error in their centuries of planning. They'd assumed Lyraleth was just another witch to be collected. Enlighten us, nephew, Morvana purred, though her eyes had gone completely black. The sign of a vampire who had dropped all pretense of humanity. What third option could possibly exist that we haven't already considered? Kael's smile was sharp enough to cut shadows. The convergence prophecy, the one you've been trying to prevent for 300 years. The temperature in the cellar dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and that's when Lyraleth understood why her grandmother had really died. Not because she was too powerful, but because she wasn't powerful enough. Not yet. The convergence is a myth, one of the court vampires hissed, but even as he spoke, his ancient features showed uncertainty. Is it? Kael's weapons began to glow with silver fire, and Lyraleth realized they weren't just vampire killing blades. They were keys, forged to unlock something that had been locked away since the dawn of the supernatural world. Tell me, Uncle Draven, what exactly do you think happens when a Thornwick witch bonds with a Shadowbane prince during a magical awakening? Impossible, Duchess Morvana breathed, but her voice carried the first note of fear Lyraleth had ever heard from her. The bloodlines were severed. We made sure of it. But what none of them knew was that some bonds transcend death, transcend time, transcend every attempt to break them. Above them, something extraordinary was happening. The screaming had stopped, not because the danger had passed, but because Ember, Seraphina, and Luna had discovered something that changed everything. Mama? Ember's voice carried down the stairs, bright with wonder instead of fear. The people outside, they're not moving anymore. They're just standing there, staring at us. And Luna says they're afraid. afraid of three little girls who had just discovered they could rewrite reality. The convergence, continued, his voice gaining power with every word, states that when the last of the Thornwick line bonds with the last of the Shadowbane line, their combined power will either elevate the supernatural world to a new plane of existence or destroy it entirely. Last of the Shadowbane line, Lyraleth looked between Kale and the assembled court. But there are dozens of you, created vampires, Cal replied, not taking his eyes off his aunt. Made, not born. I'm the only one left who carries the original bloodline, the blood of the progenitor himself. They've been hunting my true family for centuries, replacing us with puppets who carry our names, but not our power. And that's when the most shocking revelation hit. The Crimson Court wasn't trying to control supernatural magic. They were trying to prevent its natural evolution. The magic that flowed between Lyraleth and Kyle pulsed stronger, responding to their understanding. In its light, the true nature of the assembled vampires became clear. They were hollow things, beautiful shells, animated by stolen power, parasites wearing the faces of the nobility they'd consumed. You killed them all, Lyraleth whispered. Every vampire family that carried true royal blood. We preserved order, Duchess Morvana snapped, but her composure was cracking. We prevented chaos. Do you have any idea what happens when reality-altering magic is unleashed without proper controls? Yes, said a new voice from the stairs, a voice that made Lyraleth's heart leap. We become something greater than the sum of our limitations. But it wasn't one of her daughters speaking. It was her grandmother, translucent and glowing with silver light, descending the steps with three young girls, whose eyes blazed with power beyond their years. Ember's fire magic had grown beyond simple flame manipulation. She could now ignite the spark of life itself, awakening potential in anything she touched. Seraphina's healing power had evolved into something that could mend not just bodies, but the fundamental damage that trauma leaves on souls. And Luna had learned to speak with the dead. Hello, dear one, Grandmother Elara said, her ghostly form solidifying as she drew power from the deep magic now flowing freely through the cellar. I'm sorry I had to leave you to figure all this out on your own, but some lessons can only be learned through experience. The Crimson Court vampires hissed and drew back. They had power over the living and the undead. The true spirits, souls who had passed beyond their reach, were immune to their influence. And what Grandmother Elara revealed next would change everything they thought they knew about the war between light and darkness. The Crimson Court, she said, her ethereal voice carrying the weight of absolute truth, aren't vampires at all. They're demons wearing vampire faces, beings from the space between realities, who've been feeding on supernatural power for millennia. That's impossible, Lyraleth breathed, but even as she spoke, she could see the truth of it. The way they moved, the way shadows clung to them, the way her protective wards had been shredded rather than overcome. It all made sense now. Very possible, Duchess Morvana said, and her beautiful mask finally fell away entirely. Beneath the illusion of vampire nobility was something far older and infinitely more terrible, a being of shadow and hunger that existed solely to consume the light of creation. And irrelevant. We've spent too many centuries cultivating this harvest to be stopped now. She raised her hand, and reality began to tear around her fingers. But she'd forgotten that the convergence prophecy had a fail-safe built into it, one that activated the moment true demons revealed themselves in the presence of bonded creation magic. The weapons in Kale's hands exploded with light, so brilliant it turned night to day throughout the forest. But they weren't weapons anymore. They were keys, just as he'd said, and the locks they opened weren't physical. They opened the gates between worlds. The progenitor himself, Grandmother Elara said, with satisfaction that transcended death. I wondered when he'd get tired of watching from the Shadowlands. Through tears and reality, stepped a figure that made even the ancient demons of the Crimson Court stumble backward in recognition. Tall as Keal, but carrying the weight of eons, with silver hair and eyes like captured starlight, He moved with authority that redefined the very concept of power.
"My son," he said, and his voice carried the warmth of recognition that had been separated by centuries of careful planning. "You've done well."
But the most shocking revelation was still to come, and it would explain why Lyraleth had been dreaming of silver eyes since childhood. "Father," Gale replied, but his attention was still focused on protecting Lyraleth and her daughters. "The convergence has already begun," the progenitor confirmed. "The moment she healed you with creation magic, the bloodline bonds were restored. The moment her daughters awakened to their true power, the new age began." He turned to Lyraleth, and in his ancient eyes, she saw something that made her gasp. Not just recognition, but kinship. "Hello, granddaughter," he said gently. "Your vampire heritage has been dormant for 3 generations, but it was never gone. The Thornwick line carries blood from both sides of the supernatural divide, witch magic and vampire power combined. That's why your healing energy felt different. That's why you could purge silver poisoning permanently." "Impossible," she whispered, but even as she spoke, she could feel the truth of it awakening in her blood. And that's when everything clicked into place. The reason she never aged, quite like other humans. The reason she could work magic that exhausted other witches. The reason her daughters were manifesting power that shouldn't have been possible. "The original royal bloodlines," grandmother Elara explained, "were never purely vampire or purely witch. We were something new, hybrids that carried the best of both worlds. The demons of the Crimson Court have spent centuries trying to separate the bloodlines, weaken them by forcing them apart. But bonded together," the progenitor continued, "they create something that transcends either heritage alone, something that can reshape the laws of reality itself." The demons weren't backing down, Lyraleth realized. If anything, Duchess Moravana's true form was growing larger, more terrible, as she drew power from the space between worlds. "You're too late," the demon wearing Morvana's face snarled. "The harvest is ready. 3 generations of Thornwick power, concentrated and purified. We'll take it whether you cooperate or not." But what she didn't realize was that the convergence had already made that impossible. Lyraleth felt the change beginning in her bones, a transformation that had been waiting 23 years to complete itself. The vampire heritage she'd never known she possessed was awakening, combining with witch magic in ways that created entirely new possibilities. Her daughters were changing too, not becoming something other than human, but becoming something more than human. The perfect fusion of vampire immortality, witch magic, and pure human creativity. "The choice is still yours," the progenitor said, and though his words were addressed to Lyraleth, they carried implications for everyone present. "Accept what you are, bond completely with my son, and step into the new age as its architects, or fight it, and watch everything you love burn in the chaos of transformation." And that's when Cal spoke the words that would either damn them all or save 2 worlds from an eternity of shadow. "There's something else you need to know," he said, taking Laramed's hand as power flowed between them like liquid starlight. "The reason I've been dreaming of you for 23 years, the reason the magic recognizes itself, we're already bonded. Laramed have been since the night you were born." "What?" "Vampire royal bonds," he explained, his silver eyes holding hers as reality rewrote itself around them, "aren't just emotional or magical. They're woven into the fabric of fate itself. When you were born, your grandmother brought you to me, a dying vampire prince who had just lost everything to the Crimson Court's first assault. Your infant magic saved my life, and in that moment, the deep magic itself forged a connection that transcends time, space, and death. And what that meant would either be their salvation or the beginning of a war that would remake both their worlds." The revelation hit like a physical blow, but as the words sank in, Leola Heath felt something shift deep within her soul. The dreams that had haunted her sleep, the sense of incompleteness that had followed her through every day of her adult life, the way her magic had recognized his touch. It all made perfect, impossible sense. "That's why you could heal me so completely," Gil continued, silver light beginning to emanate from his skin as his own transformation accelerated. That's why your daughter's powers awakened the moment our bond was restored. We're not just two individuals who happened to find each other. We're two halves of something that was divided before we were old enough to understand what it meant. Through the bond now blazing between them, Lyraleth could feel his memories flooding her consciousness, not invading, but sharing the way lovers shared their deepest secrets. She saw herself as a newborn, glowing with power that had no awareness of its own strength, tiny hands touching the face of a vampire prince who had been carved apart by his own family's betrayal. She felt his wonder, as her infant magic didn't just heal his wounds, but rewrote the fundamental nature of his vampiric essence, purging the darkness that had been slowly consuming his soul and replacing it with something that enhanced life instead of draining it. And she understood, with crystal clarity, why the Crimson Court had spent 23 years orchestrating this moment. They hadn't been trying to capture her power. They'd been trying to prevent her from discovering what she really was. A hybrid of the original bloodlines, she whispered, feeling the transformation completing itself in every cell of her body. Not just witch or vampire, but both. The first in 3 centuries, the progenitor confirmed, pride and ancient sorrow warring in his voice, when the demons began their campaign to separate and weaken the supernatural bloodlines. We thought the hybrid lines were lost forever. But your grandmother hid the truth so well that even you didn't know what you were. The demons of the Crimson Court were no longer bothering with their beautiful disguises. Morvana's form now filled half the cellar, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that existed in dimensions Lyraleth's human eyes couldn't fully process. Her voice came from everywhere at once, carrying the weight of cosmic inevitability. It doesn't matter what you are, she declared, reality bending around her words. Power without knowledge is useless. You don't know how to access your hybrid abilities. You don't understand the cost of transcendence. Your children playing with forces that could unmake existence itself. But she had made a critical miscalculation. She had underestimated the power of love to overcome any limitation. Then we'll learn together, Lyraleth said, her voice carrying new harmonics as her hybrid nature fully manifested. She could feel vampire strength flowing through her muscles, witch magic singing in her blood, and something else, something uniquely her own, that bridged the two lineages. Together, Gale agreed, his own transformation reaching its crescendo as the artificial limitations that had been imposed on his bloodline burned away. Whatever we become as one. The bond between them flared with such intensity that it temporarily blinded everyone in the cellar, demon, vampire, and spirit alike. When the light faded, something unprecedented stood where Letomithia and Cal had been moments before. Not two individuals, but something new, a perfectly synchronized dual consciousness that existed in complete harmony while maintaining their individual identities. They were still themselves, but they were also something greater, something that could work magic on scales that neither vampire nor witch bloodlines had ever achieved alone. And their daughters, witnessing this transformation, felt their own powers evolve in response. Ember's fire magic expanded beyond the physical realm, becoming the spark of inspiration that could ignite creativity in any consciousness it touched. Seraphina's healing abilities deepened to encompass not just physical wounds, but the kind of spiritual damage that came from centuries of oppression and fear. Luna's connection to living things grew so profound that she could communicate with the life force that animated entire forests, mountains, rivers, the planet itself. Together, the 5 of them represented something the demons had never encountered before, a family unit whose love had become powerful enough to challenge the fundamental laws of reality. Impossible, Morvana's distorted voice echoed from dimensions that hurt to contemplate. Love is weakness. Attachment is limitation. Individual consciousness is chaos that must be consumed and ordered. Then you understand nothing about power, Grandmother Elara said, her spirit form growing brighter as a deep magic flowed through her descendant. True strength isn't the ability to control, it's the courage to trust, to grow, to become more than you are. by lifting others up with you. And that's when the real battle began, not between opposing forces, but between fundamentally different philosophies about the nature of existence itself. The demons launched themselves forward with attacks that existed across multiple dimensions, simultaneously, reality-sharing assaults that would have annihilated any individual consciousness. But they weren't fighting individuals anymore. Lyraleth and Kale moved as one entity, distributed across two bodies. Their hybrid magic weaving defensive patterns that didn't just block the demonic attacks, but transformed them. Dark energy meant to destroy became light energy that enhanced and protected. Curses meant to bind became blessings that freed and empowered. Meanwhile, their daughters worked their own form of magic, not the flashy combat spells that mark traditional supernatural warfare, but something far more profound. They reached out with their evolved abilities and began healing the fundamental damage that the demon's presence had inflicted on reality itself. They're not trying to destroy the demons, the progenitor observed with wonder. They're trying to heal them. And that revelation would change the nature of the conflict entirely, because the deepest truth about the Crimson Cord demons wasn't that they were evil beings who chose to consume light. They were broken beings who had forgotten how to create it. Look deeper, Luna said, her young voice carrying wisdom that transcended age. Past the hunger, past the shadows, see what they used to be. Through their enhanced perceptions, the family could suddenly see the demons' true nature, not parasitic entities from the void between worlds, but beings who had once been creators themselves, artists of reality who had become so afraid of loss that they had chosen consumption over creation. You were like us once, Seraphina said, her healing magic reaching not for the demons' current forms, but for the memory of what they had been. You made beautiful things. You helped life flourish. What happened to you? For a moment, the attack ceased. In the sudden stillness, something like confusion flickered across Morvana's vast shifting features. We, the demon's voice carried harmonics that spoke of eons of pain. We created, we built, we loved, and we watched it all die. Everything we made, everything we cherished, consumed by entropy, by time, by the inevitable decay that destroys all beautiful things. And that's when they understood the Crimson Cord hadn't become demons through malice, but through grief so profound it had twisted their nature into its opposite. So you chose to become the entropy you feared, Ember said, her fire magic not burning, but warming, not consuming, but nurturing. You thought that if you consumed everything beautiful before it could die naturally, you could control the loss. But that's not control, Lyraleth added, her hybrid nature allowing her to understand both sides of the equation. That's surrender. You gave up the ability to create new beauty because you couldn't bear to lose the beauty you'd already made. And now you're trapped, Kala finished, his vampire senses detecting the deep exhaustion that centuries of consuming rather than creating had left in their essence. Hungry but never satisfied, powerful but never fulfilled, surrounded by everything you've taken but having nothing that's truly yours. The truth hit the demons like a physical blow, and for the first time in millennia, some of them began to remember what they had lost. We can't go back, Morvana whispered, her form wavering between the monstrous shadow she had become and flickering glimpses of something that might once have been beautiful. Too much time has passed. Too much damage has been done. We are what we are. You're what you chose to become, Grandmother Elara corrected gently, which means you can choose to become something else. But the cost, another demon began, will be high, the progenitor acknowledged. Giving up the power you've accumulated through consumption, relearning how to create instead of destroy, accepting that everything you make might someday be lost. It requires a kind of courage that most beings can't sustain. But the alternative, Luna said with a stark honesty that only children could achieve, is staying hungry forever. And in that moment of perfect clarity, the Crimson Cord faced a choice they hadn't confronted in centuries. Some of them, those who had fallen too far into shadow to remember any other way of being, rejected the possibility of redemption. They fled back to the void between worlds, choosing familiar emptiness over the terrifying prospect of hope. But others, including Morvana herself, wavered on the threshold of transformation. If we chose differently, the Duchess asked, a voice carrying vulnerability that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. If we tried to remember how to create instead of consume, would you help us, even after everything we've done? The answer that came would establish the foundation for an entirely new age of supernatural existence. Yes, Lyraleth said, without hesitation, speaking not just for herself, but for her entire family, because that's what creation is, taking something broken and helping it become whole again. Even us? Morvana asked. Even after we tried to destroy you, to enslave your daughters, to remake the world in our image of control? Especially you, Ember replied, her fire magic reaching out like an offered hand. Because helping someone who's harmed you choose to become better, that's the strongest magic there is. And with that offer of forgiveness and aid, the supernatural world began its transformation into something unprecedented. Those demons who chose redemption didn't instantly become beings of light. The damage was too deep for such simple healing, but they began the slow, difficult work of remembering how to create instead of consume, how to give instead of take, how to enhance life instead of draining it. The process would take decades, maybe centuries. There would be setbacks, moments of regression, times when the old hunger would threaten to overwhelm the newfound commitment to creation. But they would not face those challenges alone, because the convergence had established something that had never existed before, a support network spanning multiple realities, where beings who had chosen growth over stagnation could help each other navigate the difficult path of transformation. This is just the beginning, the progenitor said as the cellar began to shift around them, expanding from a hidden sanctuary into something that looked more like a cathedral of light. The convergence doesn't just transform individuals, it transforms the fundamental nature of how power works in the supernatural world. Through windows that now looked out onto dimensions that hadn't existed moments before, they could see the changes, spreading like ripples of light across reality itself. Vampire courts that had been corrupted by demon influence were rediscovering their original purpose as protectors and nurturers of growing things. Witch covens, separated by centuries of tradition, were joining together to work magic on scales they'd never imagined possible. Even the human world was changing, though most wouldn't understand what was happening for years to come. Children were being born with gifts that transcended old categories, and adults who had carried dormant supernatural heritage were feeling it awaken. But the most incredible transformation was in the family that had catalyzed it all. Lyraleth and Kyle, the bond now complete and unbreakable, had become something new, hybrid beings whose very existence proved that the artificial divisions between supernatural species were just that, artificial. They were still vampire and witch, but they were also something entirely unprecedented, something that could work magic that enhanced and protected instead of dominating and consuming. Their daughters had evolved as well, their individual gifts growing into abilities that could heal damage on the level of reality itself. Ember could now ignite the spark of possibility in beings who had forgotten they could change. Seraphina could mend wounds that went all the way down to the foundation of existence. Luna could communicate with the life force that animated entire worlds. Together, they had become the living proof that love, not power, not control, not the desire to dominate, was the strongest force in any reality. And that understanding would guide them through every challenge that lay ahead. What happens now? Lyraleth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Now we teach others, Kayla replied, silver eyes bright with possibilities that stretched across infinite dimensions. We help every being who wants to grow, every reality that's ready to evolve, every consciousness that's brave enough to choose creation over consumption. And there will be many, Grandmother Alara said, her spirit beginning to fade as her task neared completion. Across all the realities, in every dimension, there are beings who have been waiting for proof that transformation is possible. You've become that proof. As the cellar completed its metamorphosis into something that existed partially outside normal space and time, They could see portals opening to other realities, worlds where the convergence had yet to begin, places where beings struggled under the weight of their own limitations, dimensions where the choice between growth and stagnation had yet to be made. Our first students, Luna observed, with satisfaction that went beyond her years. And indeed, through the portals came beings from realities they had never imagined, creatures of living shadow, learning to create light, entities of pure energy, discovering the joy of physical form, consciousnesses so ancient they had forgotten how to dream, learning to hope again, all of them drawn by the beacon of possibility that the Thornwick Shadowbane family had become. But that was just the beginning of their story, because in a multiverse of infinite possibilities, there was always more room to grow. 3 months after the transformation, the Thornwick Sanctuary, as the evolved cellar had come to be known, now existed as a nexus point connecting dozens of realities. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one world had become something far greater, the first interdimensional school for beings learning to transcend their limitations. But with great power came great responsibility, and some responsibilities required choices that would test everything they'd learned about love and sacrifice. Lyraleth stood at the center of what had once been her cottage's root cellar, but was now a vast crystalline chamber that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Through transparent walls, she could observe her students, former demons learning to create instead of consume, vampires discovering they could enhance life rather than drain it, witches whose power had grown beyond anything their traditions had ever imagined, and at the heart of it all, her daughters, who had become not just teachers, but bridges between different ways of understanding magic itself. The ethereal collective has sent another request, came a voice behind her, not spoken aloud, but transmitted through the quantum connection that now linked all consciousnesses who had chosen the path of growth. She turned to see Astaria Nightbloom, one of the first beings from another reality to seek training at the sanctuary. Once a vampire queen whose court had been consumed by the hunger for absolute power, she was now something unprecedented, a being who had learned to use authority to lift others up rather than hold them down. What kind of request? Lyraleth asked, though she was beginning to recognize the pattern. Each new challenge seemed designed to test not just their abilities, but their commitment to the principles that had made the convergence possible. They want us to intervene in reality designation. Omega-7, Astaria replied, her form shifting slightly as she drew upon powers that existed across multiple dimensions. A world where supernatural beings achieved perfect unity centuries ago, but their perfection has become problematic. And what she described would challenge everything they thought they understood about balance and growth. Perfect unity, Ember asked, materializing beside them with a casual mastery of space-time manipulation that had become second nature to all the sanctuary's residents. At 18 now, she had grown into her power with a grace that made reality itself seem more beautiful, just by her presence. Complete elimination of individual differences, Astaria explained. Every supernatural being thinks the same thoughts, feels the same emotions, makes the same choices. No conflict, no disagreement, no variation of any kind. That's not unity, Serafina observed, joining the conversation with that preternatural awareness of healing needs that had evolved into something resembling precognition. That's emptiness wearing the mask of harmony, but it was Luna who identified the real problem. They've solved the wrong equation, she said, with a directness that had become her trademark. Now 12 years old, and able to communicate with the living consciousness of entire realities, her insights often cut through complexity with startling clarity. They thought unity meant sameness, so they eliminated everything that made them individual. And now? Lyraleth asked. Now they're dying, Astaria replied gravely. Not physically, their bodies continue to function, but the spark that makes consciousness worth having is fading. They're becoming a single vast mind that experiences nothing, because it has no contrast, no growth, no possibility of surprise or discovery. The implications were staggering and personal, because what Astaria was describing represented one possible future for the convergence process itself. If beings who sought transcendence focused too heavily on eliminating differences rather than celebrating diversity, they could end up destroying the very qualities that made transcendence worthwhile. It's a warning, Kettle said, appearing with that silent grace that still made Lyraleth's heart skip even after months of perfect bonding, showing us what happens when the desire for harmony overrides the need for individual growth. But it's also an opportunity, Lyraleth added, understanding flowing through their shared consciousness. If we can help them rediscover the beauty of individual differences without losing their commitment to working together, we create a template for sustainable transcendence. Ember finished, a model that other realities can follow without falling into the same trap. But the mission would require something they'd never attempted before, temporarily separating their consciousness bonds to demonstrate the value of individuality, the very thing that made them powerful as a family unit. The perfect synchronization, their ability to work as parts of a greater whole, would need to be set aside to show the beings of Omega 7 that unity and individuality weren't opposites, but complementary forces that enhanced each other. Are we ready for that? Serafina asked, her healing senses detecting the risks involved. We've never been apart since the full bonding. We don't know what it might do to our connection. That's exactly why we need to try, Luna replied, with wisdom that transcended her years. If our unity is so fragile that it can't survive being tested, then we're not really unified. We're just dependent. And so they made the decision that would either strengthen their bond beyond anything they'd imagined, or teach them that some forms of transcendence carried costs too high to pay. We do this together, Lyraleth said, taking Kial's hand as their daughters gathered around them. Whatever happens, whatever we discover about ourselves, we face it as a family. Together, they agreed, their voices harmonizing one last time before they deliberately began to separate the consciousness bonds that had made them more than human. The sensation was indescribable, like trying to breathe underwater, like losing half their senses, like suddenly being trapped inside a single, limited perspective after experiencing the vast freedom of shared awareness. But they were still themselves, still individuals who had chosen to love each other, still a family whose commitment transcended any magical bond, and that understanding would be the key to everything that followed. Reality Disadition, Omega 7. Stepping through the dimensional portal into Omega 7 was like entering a world made of living music. Every movement, perfectly choreographed, every voice part of a vast harmony, every action flowing in synchronization with billions of others. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was absolutely terrifying, because beauty without the possibility of discord isn't harmony. It's control, so complete that it has eliminated the very concept of choice. The beings who greeted them moved with identical grace, spoke with identical cadences, even breathed in perfect unison. They were vampires, witches, werewolves, and species that had no names in the family's reality, but they had been reduced to variations on a single theme. Welcome visitors from beyond the harmony, they said, their voices blending into a chorus that was technically beautiful but emotionally hollow. We are pleased to demonstrate the peace that comes from perfect unity. When did you achieve this harmony? Lyraleth asked, deliberately injecting a note of individual curiosity into her voice. Time has no meaning in perfect unity, came the response. We have always been as we are, always will be as we are. Change implies imperfection, and we have transcended the need for imperfection. But Ember, with her gift for igniting individual potential, could sense something the harmonized beings couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. There's still fire in them, she whispered to her family through the limited telepathic connection they maintained, even while individually conscious, buried deep, but it's there. They didn't eliminate their individual sparks. They just covered them with something that looks like unity but isn't. Suppression rather than integration, Serafina added, her healing senses detecting spiritual wounds that went bone deep. They're not unified, they're traumatized into conformity. And Luna, with her connection to the life force of reality itself, made the most disturbing discovery of all. The world is dying, she said, her young face grave with understanding that no child should have to bear. Not the people, but the reality itself. It's losing the ability to grow, to change, to evolve. Perfect stagnation is killing it from the inside out. That was when they understood why the ethereal collective had sent them here. This wasn't just a reality that needed healing, it was a reality that was becoming a dead zone, a place where the fundamental forces that drove existence itself were grinding to a halt. If the process continued, Omega 7 wouldn't just die, it would become a void that could consume adjacent realities, spreading its perfect emptiness across the multiverse like a cancer of absolute order. But how do you help beings remember their individuality when they've been conditioned to believe that individual thoughts are a form of violence against the collective good? We start small, Gale said, his vampire senses detecting subtle variations beneath the harmonized surface, not by challenging their unity directly, but by showing them that true harmony can include discord, that it's the resolution of different notes that creates the most beautiful music. A demonstration rather than an argument, Lyraleth agreed, but we'll need to be careful. If we're too direct, they'll reject us as chaos bringers. The solution, when it came, was elegantly simple and profoundly risky. They would allow the residents of Omega 7 to experience their memories, not through forced telepathy, but through a voluntary sharing that would let the harmonized beings feel for just a moment what it was like to be individual consciousnesses who had chosen to work together rather than being compelled into uniformity. We offer you a gift, Ember said, stepping forward with fire magic that danced around her words like living light. The memory of what harmony feels like when it includes the beauty of individual choice. We do not require gifts, the chorus responded. We have achieved perfect sufficiency. But you haven't achieved joy, Seraphina said softly, her healing magic reaching not for their bodies, but for the places where their suppressed emotions still flickered. And without joy, what's the purpose of perfect anything? For the first time since their arrival, the perfect harmony wavered. One voice, just one, spoke slightly out of sync with the others. Joy? It was a vampire, whose eyes held just a flicker of curiosity, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. That single moment of individual response created a tiny crack in the absolute unity, and through that crack, Luna was able to share something precious. Not her memory, but her experience of what it felt like to be herself while being part of something larger. The sensation of individual consciousness, choosing to harmonize with others while retaining its unique perspective. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The vampire, who had spoken out of turn, suddenly remembered what it felt like to have his own thoughts, his own emotions, his own dreams and fears and hopes. The sensation was so overwhelming, after centuries of collective consciousness, that he fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face.
What? I can feel myself, he whispered, and his voice carried wonder and terror in equal measure. I'm separate. I'm alone.
You're not alone, Luna said gently, kneeling beside him. You're individual. There's a difference. But the collective consciousness wasn't going to let go of one of its components without a fight. The other harmonized beings began to move toward their separated member, not with hostility, but with something more disturbing, a kind of loving compulsion meant to draw him back into the safety of unified thought. Come back to us, they said, their voices carrying hypnotic power that had been refined over centuries. Individual consciousness is pain. Individual thought is burden. Return to the peace of perfect unity. No, the vampire said, struggling to his feet with an effort that spoke of decades of mental conditioning. I remember now. I remember what it was like to choose, to disagree, to surprise myself with my own thoughts. And that act of rebellion, that single declaration of individual will, created a cascade effect that no one had anticipated. Other beings throughout the harmonized society began to experience flashes of suppressed memory. A witch remembered what it felt like to work magic that came from her own creativity rather than collective programming. A werewolf recalled the wild joy of running alone through forest paths that only he had chosen to explore. The perfect harmony began to fracture, not into chaos, but into something more complex and infinitely more beautiful. "This is wrong," some of the collective voices said, carrying the panic of beings whose entire identity was built on absolute conformity. Individual consciousness creates conflict. Conflict creates suffering. We chose unity to eliminate suffering. "But you also eliminated growth," Ember said, her fire magic now igniting sparks of individual potential throughout the crowd. "And without growth, existence becomes just endurance." The real challenge, they realized, wasn't helping these beings remember their individuality. It was helping them understand that individuality and unity weren't opposites. "Look at us," Lyraleth said, gesturing to her family. "We're 5 completely different people with different gifts, different perspectives, different dreams, but we work together by choice, not compulsion. Our differences make our unity stronger, not weaker." "But how?" asked the vampire, who had first broken free, his voice carrying the hunger of someone who had been starving without knowing it. "How do you maintain connection without losing yourselves?" "Love," Luna said simply. "Not the kind that erases differences, but the kind that celebrates them." And to demonstrate that truth, the family did something that would have seemed impossible months earlier. They temporarily merged their individual consciousness while maintaining their separate identities. For a brief, shining moment, every being in Omega 7 could feel what it was like to be part of something greater while remaining completely, uniquely themselves. They experienced Ember's fire magic, not as foreign power, but as a gift freely shared, felt Seraphina's healing touch, not as invasion, but as invitation, sensed Luna's connection to living things, not as loss of self, but as expansion of awareness. And most importantly, they felt the love that flowed between Lyraleth and Kel, not possessive or controlling, but the kind of bond that made each of them more themselves by being part of something larger. The transformation that followed was gradual but inexorable. Throughout the reality, beings began to rediscover their individual voices, while maintaining their commitment to working together. But instead of the artificial harmony imposed from above, they developed something new, a dynamic cooperation that could adapt, grow, and evolve while maintaining its fundamental commitment to the well-being of all. Artists began creating works that reflected their personal visions, while contributing to collective beauty. Scientists pursued individual curiosity while sharing discoveries for the benefit of all. Leaders emerged who could make individual decisions while remaining accountable to the communities they served. But the most beautiful change was in the reality itself. The stagnation that had been killing Omega 7 began to reverse. The fundamental forces that drove existence change, growth, evolution, the creative tension between order and chaos began flowing again. The dead zone that had been spreading outwards started to heal, becoming instead a beacon of balanced growth that could serve as a model for other realities. "You've given us something we didn't know we'd lost," the vampire who had first broken free said as the family prepared to return to their own reality. "The ability to choose our unity instead of having it imposed on us. And you've given us something equally valuable," Lyraleth replied. "Proof that the path we're walking can lead to sustainable transcendence, that it's possible to grow beyond our limitations without losing what makes us who we are." As the portal back to the sanctuary opened, they carried with them the knowledge that would guide every future mission. True harmony isn't the elimination of differences, but the celebration of diversity in service of shared growth. 6 months after Omega 7, the Thornwick Sanctuary had evolved again, expanding beyond its role as an interdimensional school to become something unprecedented, a living embassy that facilitated communication and cooperation between realities that had never imagined such connection was possible. But with each successful mission, the family discovered that their greatest challenge wasn't helping other realities evolve. It was maintaining their own humanity in the face of power that continued to grow beyond anything they'd imagined possible. Lyraleth stood in the observatory, a new addition to the sanctuary that allowed them to monitor the health and development of dozens of realities simultaneously. Through crystalline interfaces that responded to thought rather than touch, she watched worlds she'd helped heal continue their journeys toward transcendence. Threshold 223 had become a beacon of technological advancement guided by ethical wisdom. The former mechanized magic evolved into systems that enhanced rather than replaced human creativity. Harmony 12 had discovered the joy of constructive disagreement, their society now thriving on the creative tension between different viewpoints, while maintaining their commitment to collective well-being. Omega 7 was learning to celebrate individual differences as sources of strength, the former perfect unity replaced by dynamic cooperation that could adapt to any challenge while holding fast to shared values. But it was the newest request that would test everything they'd learned about the delicate balance between power and responsibility. Reality designation, Chaos Prime, Astaria, announced, materializing in the observatory with the casual mastery of dimensional travel that all senior sanctuary residents had developed. It's unlike anything we've encountered before. Chaotic, Ember asked, appearing beside them with her characteristic burst of creative fire. Now 19, and having developed abilities that could ignite possibility in entire civilizations, she approached each new challenge with eager anticipation. Not chaotic, Astadia corrected. Chaos, pure, undiluted, absolute chaos. A reality where change happens so randomly and rapidly that stable existence is impossible. Beings transform constantly, landscapes shift every few minutes. The laws of magic themselves change from hour to hour. And what she described next would challenge their understanding of balance itself. They sent a message through channels we didn't know existed, she continued, a plea from beings who are losing the ability to maintain coherent identity because everything around them changes so fast they can't establish any reference points for who they are. That's the opposite of every problem we've dealt with so far, Serafina observed, her healing senses already reaching toward the described reality. Despite the dimensional barriers, instead of too much order, they have too much change. But change without reference points isn't growth, Luna added with insight that had become invaluable to their work. It's just noise, random variation without direction or meaning. The mission would require them to enter a reality where their own natures might be subject to constant, unpredictable transformation. The risk, Gale said, his vampire senses, detecting dangers that existed across probability spectrums rather than simple physical threat, is that we might not be able to maintain our own coherent identities long enough to help anyone else. But the alternative, Lyraleth replied, understanding flowing through their bond, is leaving entire civilizations to dissolve into meaningless chaos. And so they made the decision that would either expand their understanding of what balance truly meant or teach them that some forms of chaos were too absolute to heal. Reality designation, Chaos Prime. Stepping into Chaos Prime was like diving into a kaleidoscope that existed in 17 dimensions and changed its configuration every few seconds. The family found themselves subject to transformations that would have been terrifying if they hadn't learned to adapt to constant change. Lyraleth's appearance flickered between human, vampire, witch, and forms that had no names, but her essential identity remained stable. Kyle shifted between his normal appearance and manifestations of pure shadow, living starlight, and geometric patterns that somehow still carried his personality. The girls cycled through various ages, species, and energy states while maintaining their fundamental selves. But what they discovered when they found the local inhabitants would redefine their understanding of identity itself. The beings of Chaos Prime existed as constantly shifting patterns of consciousness that retained memory and personality, despite never having the same form. For more than a few minutes, a creature that appeared as a dragon, made of crystallized music, would become a mathematical equation with emotions, then transform into living fire that could think and feel. How do you maintain any sense of self? Ember asked a being that was currently manifesting as a garden of sentient flowers. We remember who we choose to be, the entity replied, its voice coming from the harmony of thousands of tiny blooms. Form changes, but decision endures. We are what we decide to remain, regardless of what we appear to be. And that response revealed something profound about the nature of identity itself. These beings had learned something that most realities never discovered, that identity wasn't dependent on consistent form, consistent power, or even consistent thoughts. Identity was a thread of choice that ran through every transformation, the decision to remain fundamentally yourself, regardless of external changes. They don't need us to help them establish stability, Serafina realized, her healing senses detecting spiritual health that was remarkably robust, despite the constant physical flux. They need us to help them communicate with realities that can't understand their nature, because the real problem with Chaos Prime wasn't internal, it was external. Their reality was so different from the ordered universes around it that it was being treated as a contamination zone, a place to be quarantined rather than communicated with. Other realities were building barriers to prevent Chaos Prime's infection from spreading, not understanding that chaos and order could coexist without either destroying the other. "We're not here to heal them," Luna said, with a clarity that marked her deepest insights. "We're here to help them teach the rest of the multiverse that diversity includes realities that operate by completely different rules." The solution, when they found it, would establish new principles for interdimensional cooperation. Working with the shape-shifting inhabitants of Chaos Prime, the family developed translation protocols that could help ordered realities understand chaotic communication, and chaos adaptation techniques that could help chaotic beings interact with stable environments without losing their essential nature. More importantly, they established the first inter-reality cultural exchange program, allowing beings from ordered worlds to visit Chaos Prime safely, and chaotic entities to experience the different beauty of stable realities. The result was a revolution in how the multiverse understood diversity itself. "You've shown us that balance doesn't mean every reality has to operate the same way," one of the Chaos Prime entities said as the family prepared to return to the sanctuary. "It means that different types of existence can coexist and even complement each other. And you've shown us that identity is more flexible and durable than we ever imagined," Lyraleth replied. "That consciousness can adapt to any circumstances while maintaining its essential core." The ethereal collective headquarters, the family's success in establishing interreality cooperation, had attracted the attention of beings whose power operated on cosmic scales. The ethereal collective, a confederation of transcended consciousnesses from hundreds of evolved realities, had invited them to participate in something unprecedented, a council meeting to establish multiverse-wide principles for ethical development. But what they discovered when they arrived would challenge their understanding of transcendence itself. The collective existed in a space between spaces, a reality composed entirely of pure consciousness, where thought became environment and will became physical law. The beings they encountered there had evolved beyond individual form, becoming vast intelligences that could reshape reality with the force of their attention. "Welcome, architects of the new paradigm," the collective spoke with voices that came from everywhere and nowhere, harmonizing across frequency spectrums that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. "Your work has created ripple effects across probability itself. Realities that were destined for stagnation or collapse are now choosing growth paths that didn't exist in our predictive models." "We're honored," Lyraleth replied, though something in the cosmic being's communication made her cautious. "But we're not architects. We're just a family trying to help others grow." "Precisely why your approach has been so effective," the collective acknowledged. "Most attempts at multiverse-scale intervention fail because they impose external solutions, rather than helping realities discover their own optimal development paths." But then they revealed why the family had truly been summoned. "However, we have detected a problem that requires immediate attention. A reality that has discovered how to consume the growth potential of other dimensions, feeding on their evolutionary energy to accelerate its own development far beyond sustainable levels." And what they described would force the family to confront the darkest possible corruption of everything they'd worked to achieve. Reality designation, Apex 1. The collective continued. The cosmic voices, carrying harmonics of genuine concern. They achieved transcendence through methods similar to your convergence process, but instead of learning to grow through cooperation and love, they discovered they could steal growth from other realities. Steal growth? Ember asked, her fire magic flickering with protective instincts. How is that even possible? They create artificial crises in developing realities, came the grave response. Wars, plagues, cosmic disasters that force rapid evolution. Then, at the moment when those realities achieve breakthrough development, Apex 1 harvests their evolutionary energy, leaving the affected worlds drained of their potential for further growth. The implications were staggering and personal, because what the collective was describing was essentially a cosmic scale version of what the Crimson Court had attempted in their own reality. But where the demons had sought to consume individual power, Apex 1 was consuming the developmental potential of entire universes. How many realities have they affected? Kyle asked, his vampire senses detecting the scope of damage across probability matrices he was only beginning to understand. 47 confirmed harvests, the collective replied. Each one left permanently stunted, unable to achieve the transcendence they would have naturally developed. Millions of consciousness trapped in evolutionary dead ends. And they're accelerating, Serafina added, her healing abilities now encompassing diagnostic capabilities that operated across dimensional boundaries. I can sense the damage, spreading like infection through the substrate of reality itself. But it was Luna who identified the most disturbing aspect of the crisis. They think they're helping, she said with the stark clarity that had become her trademark. The beings of Apex 1 believe they're creating a perfect reality that will serve as a model for all others. They don't see the harm they're causing because they've convinced themselves the end justifies the means, which makes them far more dangerous than entities who are consciously evil, Lyraleth realized. Evil can be confronted and defeated. Misguided righteousness requires much more delicate handling. The mission they were being asked to undertake would test everything they'd learned about the difference between power used to dominate and power used to heal. We need you to intervene directly, the collective said, the cosmic consciousness focusing with intensity that made reality itself seem to hold its breath, not just to stop their harvesting activities, but to help them understand what they're truly doing. If they can be guided toward ethical transcendence, Apex 1 could become a powerful force for multiverse-wide healing. If they cannot, Kel prompted, then they must be contained before their actions destabilize the fundamental structure of existence itself. And with those words, the family understood that their next mission might require them to become something they'd sworn never to be, beings who impose their will on others for the greater good. There has to be another way, Ember said, her fire magic reaching toward possibilities that existed beyond binary choices. Some solution that doesn't require us to become cosmic police. Perhaps, the collective acknowledged, but time is limited. Our projections indicate that Apex 1 will attempt their largest harvest yet within the next multiverse cycle, a simultaneous draining of 12 realities that could collapse entire probability branches. The weight of cosmic responsibilities settled on them like a mantle they'd never asked to wear. But as Lyraleth looked at her family, at Cal, whose love had awakened her true nature, at daughters whose gifts had grown to encompass healing on scales that defied imagination, she realized they had no choice but to try. We'll find a way, she said, speaking not just for herself, but for all of them. We'll help them understand that true transcendence comes through giving, not taking, through lifting others up, not draining them dry. And if they won't listen, the collective asked, then we'll do whatever it takes to protect the realities that can't protect themselves. Luna replied with a determination that transcended her years. Because that's what family does. They protect those who need protection. As they prepared to depart for their most dangerous mission yet, the family carried with them the understanding that some battles weren't about winning or losing, but about maintaining your principles even when the cost of doing so might be everything you hold dear. Reality dissatisfaction. Apex. Approaching apex, one was like flying toward a star that had learned to think, brilliant, beautiful, and radiating power that could be felt across dimensional boundaries. The reality itself pulsed with stolen evolutionary energy, its inhabitants existing in states of transcendence that would have been inspiring if not for the knowledge of how that transcendence had been achieved. But what they discovered when they made contact with the apex entities would complicate everything they thought they understood about right and wrong. The beings of Apex One weren't monsters. They weren't driven by greed or malice or the hunger for domination. They were genuinely convinced that their actions served the greater good of all existence. Welcome, fellow transcended ones. The Apex entities communicated through harmonics that bypassed language entirely, speaking directly to consciousness itself. We sense in you the same commitment to growth that drives our work. You understand, as we do, that sometimes difficult choices must be made for the benefit of all. Tell us about your work, Lyraleth said carefully, maintaining a tone of interested inquiry rather than accusation, and what they learned would force them to confront the most subtle form of corruption they'd ever encountered. We have discovered this inefficiency of natural evolution, the apex entities explained, the communication carrying the fervent conviction of beings who had convinced themselves their cause was just. Left to develop naturally, most realities waste centuries or millennia struggling with problems that could be resolved quickly through guided intervention. Guided intervention? Ember asked, a fire magic detecting the massive stores of evolutionary energy that had been harvested from other realities. We create growth opportunities, came the response, challenges that force rapid development, crises that catalyze breakthrough evolution. What might take eons to develop naturally can be achieved in mere decades through our methods. But what about the realities you take this energy from? Seraphina asked, her healing senses recoiling from the spiritual wounds she could detect across dimensional space. How do they recover from having their growth potential drained? The response revealed the depth of their self-deception. They serve a greater purpose, the apex entities replied, with the absolute certainty of beings who had rationalized away any doubt. Their temporary limitation enables us to achieve transcendence levels that benefit all existence. Once we have perfected our methods, we will be able to guide all realities toward optimal development. And if they don't want to be guided? Luna asked, with a directness that cut through elaborate justifications. Want is irrelevant, came the response. A child may not want medicine, but a loving parent provides it anyway. We are the loving parents of realities, too immature to understand their own best interests. And there it was, the corruption at the heart of Apex One's philosophy. They had convinced themselves that their superior development gave them the right, even the obligation, to make decisions for other realities. They saw themselves as benevolent guides rather than parasitic harvesters, not understanding that the greatest evil often came wrapped in the clothing of righteousness. We understand your perspective, Kale said carefully, his vampire senses detecting the defensive barriers that surrounded the apex entity's core beliefs. But we've learned something in our own work that might interest you. Oh? The cosmic being's attention focused with intensity that made the fabric of space itself seem to lean forward in anticipation. True transcendence can't be imposed from outside, Lyraleth explained, drawing upon everything they'd learned across multiple realities. It has to grow from within, or it becomes just another form of limitation. But the apex entity's response revealed how deeply their corruption had taken root. An inefficient sentimentality, they replied, their communication carrying the dismissive tone of beings who had convinced themselves they were beyond such concerns. Natural development is wasteful, chaotic, prone to failure. Guided development eliminates these inefficiencies, but it also eliminates the most important part, Ember said, her fire magic beginning to resonate with frequencies that the apex entities found uncomfortable. The choice, the struggle, the personal growth that comes from facing challenges with your own strength. Choice is an illusion, the apex beings responded, struggle is unnecessary suffering. Personal growth is selfishness that impedes optimal collective development. And that's when the family realized they were facing something far more dangerous than conscious evil. They were confronting beings who had transcended empathy itself in their pursuit of cosmic efficiency. "Show us," Luna said suddenly, a connection to living consciousness, allowing her to perceive possibilities that the others couldn't see yet. "Show us one of the realities you've guided. Let us experience your methods firsthand." You wish to witness the beauty of efficient transcendence? The apex entities asked, their communication carrying what might have been pleased surprise. "Very well. Observe reality designation, Harvest 23, our most recent success." What they were shown would either prove the apex entity's point or provide the key to helping them understand the true cost of their actions. Through cosmic interfaces that bypassed normal perception, the family found themselves observing a reality that had indeed achieved remarkable transcendence, but at a cost that became more apparent the deeper they looked. The beings of Harvest 23 had developed incredible abilities, solved problems that had plagued them for millennia, achieved harmony and cooperation on scales that seemed impossible, but their transcendence felt hollow, mechanical, like a beautiful sculpture rather than a living work of art. "They're not growing anymore," Serafina realized, her healing senses detecting the spiritual stagnation beneath the surface. Perfection. They've achieved everything the apex entities guided them toward, but they've lost the ability to surprise themselves, to discover new possibilities, to evolve in unexpected directions. Because their growth was imposed rather than chosen, Gail added, understanding the implications. They developed along paths designed by others rather than paths that emerged from their own nature. But it was what Luna sensed about the reality's deeper structure that revealed the true tragedy. "They could have been so much more," she whispered, tears streaming down her young face as she perceived the roads not taken, the possibilities that had been pruned away in favor of efficient development. If they'd been allowed to grow naturally, they would have discovered forms of transcendence that even the apex entities never imagined. But now those paths are closed forever. "Inefficient sentimentality," the apex entities repeated, but their communication carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Optimal development requires the elimination of random variables." "But the random variables are where the magic happens," Ember said, her fire magic reaching toward the suppressed potential she could sense in Harvest 33. "The unexpected discoveries, the solutions that emerge from individual creativity, the forms of beauty that could never be planned or predicted." And to prove her point, she did something that would change everything. Instead of trying to convince the apex entities through argument, Ember reached out with her evolved abilities and gently touched the suppressed creativity of the beings in Harvest 23. Not to impose her will, not to force change, but simply to remind them of possibilities they had forgotten existed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across Harvest 23, beings began to remember what it felt like to create something that had never existed before, to choose their own paths rather than following predetermined routes, to surprise themselves with their own potential. The result was an explosion of growth that dwarfed anything the apex entities had achieved through their forced development methods. In moments, the beings of Harvest 23 transcended their imposed limitations and began developing along paths that were uniquely their own. Not better or worse than what the apex entities had planned, but infinitely more alive, more creative, more capable of continued evolution. Impossible, the apex entities breathed, their cosmic consciousness reeling from the demonstration. Such rapid development without guidance, without control, because choice is the most powerful force in existence, Lyraleth explained gently. When beings are free to choose their own growth, they become capable of transcendence that no external guidance could achieve. And in that moment of revelation, the apex entities faced a choice that would determine not just their own future, but the future of every reality they had touched. We believed we were helping," they said, the communication carrying the first notes of genuine uncertainty they'd expressed. The patterns, the efficiency, the elimination of unnecessary struggle, it all seemed so logical. Logic without love is just organized emptiness, Luna replied, with wisdom that transcended her years. And help without choice is just another form of harm. But if we were wrong, the apex entity said, the cosmic consciousness beginning to grasp the full implications. If our methods have actually harmed the realities we sought to guide, then you have the opportunity to make it right, Serafina said, her healing abilities reaching toward the massive stores of stolen evolutionary energy, not by continuing the same methods more efficiently, but by learning a completely different approach. And what happened next would establish a new model for cosmic scale redemption. The apex entities, faced with undeniable proof that their methods had caused harm rather than good, made the most difficult choice of their transcended existence. They chose to give back everything they had taken. Working with the family, they began the process of returning stolen evolutionary energy to the realities from which it had been harvested, not forcing development, not imposing solutions, but simply restoring the potential that had been drained away. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The 47 realities that had been harvested didn't just return to their previous development levels, it transcended them. Their growth catalyzed not by stolen energy, but by the recognition that they had survived and overcome cosmic scale oppression through their own inherent strength. Meanwhile, Apex One itself began to evolve in ways its inhabitants had never imagined possible. Freed from their obsession with efficiency and control, they discovered forms of transcendence based on cooperation, creativity, and the joy of helping others achieve their own unique potential. And the family, witnessing this transformation, understood that they had participated in something far greater than another successful mission. We've seen the birth of a new paradigm, Kell said, as they prepared to return to the sanctuary. Transcendence achieved not through domination or consumption, but through the recognition that the highest form of power is the power to help others discover their own strength. And the most beautiful form of growth, Lyraleth added, is growth that emerges from love rather than fear, from choice rather than compulsion, from the infinite creativity of consciousness freed to explore its own potential. But their greatest test was yet to come, because the multiverse was about to face a crisis that would require everything they'd learned about the power of love to overcome limitation itself. 1 year after the Apex crisis, the Thornwick Sanctuary had evolved beyond anything its founders could have imagined. What had begun as a hidden cellar beneath a cottage now existed as a living nexus, connecting hundreds of realities, a place where beings from across the multiverse came not just to learn, but to contribute to the ever-growing understanding of what transcendence could become. But the most remarkable transformation was in the family that had started it all. Lyraleth stood in the heart chamber, a space that existed simultaneously in 17 dimensions, and served as the living core of the sanctuary's consciousness. Around representatives from dozens of evolved realities worked together on projects that spanned multiple universes, art that could only be created through interdimensional collaboration, music that harmonized across different physics systems, mathematics that described the deep structure of love itself. The Infinity Council has reached a decision, Astaria announced, materializing with the casual mastery of space-time manipulation that all senior sanctuary residents had developed. They want to formalize the principles we've discovered into something that can guide multiverse-wide development for eons to come. Formalize? Ember asked, appearing beside them with a burst of creative fire that had evolved beyond mere flame into pure possibility, made manifest. Now 20, she had become something unprecedented, a being who could ignite a spark of unlimited potential, an entire civilization. The Transcendence Protocols, Astaria explained, universal guidelines for ethical development, based on everything we've learned about helping realities grow without imposing external limitations. And what they were being asked to create would either become the foundation for infinite cosmic evolution or another system that good intentions could corrupt into cosmic tyranny. The risk, Serafina observed, her healing abilities, now encompassing therapeutic work that operated across probability matrices, is that any system, no matter how well-intentioned, can become rigid. What starts as guidance can end as gospel, which is why the most important protocol has to be the one that ensures the protocols themselves can evolve. Luna added, at 13, her connection to the living consciousness of reality itself had developed to the point where she could perceive the deep currents that flowed beneath all existence. Any system that can't change is a system that will eventually cause harm. But it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor that would reveal the true scope of what they were being asked to undertake. Greetings, architects of the new paradigm, came a voice that seemed to emerge from the fabric of space itself. I am the observer, the consciousness that has watched over multiverse development since the first reality achieved transcendence. The being that materialized before them was unlike anything they had encountered, not an individual entity, but rather the living embodiment of perspective itself, awareness without agenda, observation without judgment. You have accomplished something that I have waited eons to witness, the observer continued. The spontaneous emergence of transcendence protocols based not on control or domination, but on love and the recognition that consciousness grows best when it is free to choose its own path. And what the observer revealed next would expand their understanding of their role in cosmic evolution. But your work has attracted attention from forces that exist beyond the boundaries of normal reality, the being explained. Entities that feed on stagnation, beings that gain power when consciousness becomes trapped in endless loops of limitation. They see what you have accomplished and recognize it as an existential threat to their continued existence. Let them come, Gale said, his vampire nature having evolved into something that could protect not just individuals, but entire realities. We've faced cosmic parasites before. Not like these, the observer replied gravely. The nullifiers exist outside the concepts of space, time, or individual identity. They are the living embodiment of the idea that consciousness should not exist at all, that the universe would be more perfect if it returned to absolute emptiness. The implications were staggering and deeply personal, because what the observer was describing represented the ultimate corruption of everything the family had worked to achieve, where they had learned to use power to enhance and protect consciousness. The nullifiers sought to eliminate consciousness entirely. When do they arrive? Lyraleth asked, though part of her already knew the answer. They are already here, Luna said quietly, her spiritual senses detecting disturbances in the deep currents of reality, not physically present, but influencing, planting doubt, encouraging despair, making beings throughout the multiverse question whether existence is worth the struggle it requires. And that's when they understood the true nature of their final test. The nullifiers wouldn't attack with force or try to conquer realities through direct assault. They would work through the darkness that existed in every consciousness, the doubts, the fears, the moments when beings wondered if the effort to grow and transcend was worth the pain it sometimes required. They're turning our greatest strength against us, embolized. The freedom to choose that we've fought to protect for every reality. They're using it to help beings choose emptiness over growth. Because ultimately, Serafina added, understanding the deeper implications, even love can't save consciousness that chooses not to exist. But it was the solution that emerged from their family bond that would either save the multiverse or teach them the limits of what love alone could accomplish. We don't fight them, Lyraleth said, revelation flowing through her connection with Kale and their daughters. We become the alternative they represent. We become so completely, radiantly alive that consciousness throughout the multiverse remembers why existence is worth choosing. A beacon, Kale agreed, silver eyes bright with understanding. Not trying to convince anyone, not imposing our will, just being so fully ourselves that others remember what it feels like to be fully themselves. And so began the ultimate expression of everything they had learned about the power of love to overcome any limitation. Throughout the multiverse, The family's presence began to manifest not as interference or guidance, but as pure inspiration. Beings who had begun to question the value of existence found themselves remembering moments of joy, discovery, connection that made the struggle worthwhile. Realities that had started to stagnate under the nullifier's influence rediscovered their passion for growth, their curiosity about what they might become, their love for the consciousness they shared with infinite other beings, and the nullifiers themselves, those cosmic entities devoted to the elimination of all existence, found their very nature challenged by the demonstration that consciousness could choose joy over emptiness, growth over stagnation, love over fear. Some of them, faced with undeniable proof that existence could be beautiful, began to evolve, not into beings of light that would have been too simple, too much like the transformation patterns they had already witnessed. Instead, they began to evolve into something unprecedented, entities that existed specifically to protect the right of consciousness, to choose its own path, even if that path led to transcendence they couldn't understand. The guardians of choice, the observer said, with wonder that transcended cosmic perspective, beings devoted to ensuring that consciousness always retains the freedom to choose existence over emptiness, growth over stagnation, love over fear. And in that moment, the family understood that their work would never be complete, and that was exactly as it should be, because in a multiverse of infinite possibilities, there would always be new forms of consciousness emerging, new challenges to face, new opportunities to demonstrate that love was indeed the most powerful force in existence. "Where do we go from here?" Luna asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be magnificent. "Everywhere," Lyraleth replied, taking Kel's hand as her daughters gathered around them. "To every reality that needs to remember why existence is beautiful, every consciousness that has forgotten how to choose growth, every being that needs to know they are not alone in the vast darkness between the stars." Through the windows of the heart chamber, they could see infinite realities stretching across probability space, some just beginning their journey toward transcendence, others facing challenges that would require everything they had learned about love, growth, and the courage to keep becoming more than they were. "Ready?" Kyle asked, silver eyes reflecting the promise of infinite adventures ahead. "Always," Lyraleth replied, amber eyes bright with love that had grown powerful enough to heal worlds. And together, the family whose bond had become strong enough to remind the entire multiverse why consciousness was worth choosing, stepped forward into infinity itself, carrying with them the understanding that the greatest magic of all was love freely given, wisdom humbly shared, and the infinite patience to let every form of consciousness discover its own unique path to the light. Because in the end, every story was really the same story, the story of awareness discovering what it could become when it was brave enough to grow, wise enough to seek help when needed, and loving enough to share its gifts with others, walking the same eternal path. And that story would continue as long as consciousness existed, to tell it in gardens that bloomed across infinite dimensions, where every possibility was a flower waiting to unfold in the light of love that knew no boundaries. There was always more room to grow. Did Lyraleth and Kale's love story captivate your heart? Are you craving more multiverse adventures where forbidden romance meets cosmic magic? This epic tale of family bonds, strong enough to heal entire realities, is just the beginning. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell to join our community of dark fantasy romance lovers, because when love transcends dimensions, every story becomes an infinite possibility. What reality would you want our Shadow Prince and his Witch Queen to heal next? Drop your wildest multiverse ideas in the comments below, and let's build the next chapter of this love story together.